Welcome to Saturday Morning Classics. We are currently reading The Amityville Horror by J. Anson. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back and relax, and enjoy the story. This week we are starting on Chapter 14. January 2nd. When George came out of the house in the morning, the cloven-hoofed tracks were still visible in the frozen snow. The animals' footprints led right past Harry's compound and ended at the entrance to the garage. George was speechless when he saw that the door to the garage was almost torn off its metal frame. George himself had closed and locked the heavy overhead door. To wrench it away from its frame would not only have created a great racket, but would require a strength far beyond that of any human being. George stood in the snow, staring at the tracks and wrecked door. His mind raced back to the morning when he had found his front door torn open, and to the night he had seen the pig standing behind Missy at her window. He remembers saying out loud, "What the hell is going on around here?" as he squeezed past the twisted door into the garage. He turned on the light and looked about. The garage was still packed with his motorcycle, the children's bicycles, an electric lawnmower that had been left by the DeFeos, the old gas-powered machine he had brought from Deer Park, garden furniture, tools, equipment, and cans of paint and oil. The concrete floor of the garage was covered with a light dusting of snow that had drifted through the partly open door. Obviously, it had been off its frame for several hours. "Is there anybody in here?" George shouted. Only the sound of a rising wind outside the garage answered him. By the time George drove off to his office, he was more angry than frightened. If he had had any terror of the unknown, it had been dismissed by the thought of what it was going to cost him to repair the damaged door. He didn't know if the insurance company would pay him for something like this, and he just didn't need $200 or $300 of extra expense. George doesn't recall how he ever maneuvered the Ford van over the dangerous snow and ice-covered roads to Syosset. His frustration at being unable to comprehend his bad luck blocked out any concern for his own safety. At the office, he quickly occupied himself with his immediate problems and for the next several hours was able to put aside any thoughts about 112 Ocean Avenue. Before he'd left home, George had told Kathy about the garage door and the tracks in the snow. She had tried calling her mother, but there was no answer. Then Kathy remembered that Joan always shopped on Friday mornings rather than buck the Saturday crowds at the supermarket. She went upstairs to her bedroom, intending to change the linen in all the rooms and vacuum the rugs. Kathy's mind raced with the details of thoroughly cleaning her house for the first time. If she didn't occupy herself completely until George returned, she knew she'd fall to pieces. She had just finished putting fresh cases on her pillows and was lumping them up when she was embraced from behind. She froze, then instinctively called out, "Danny?" The grip around her waist tightened. It was stronger than the familiar woman's touch she had experienced in the kitchen. Kathy sensed that a man was holding her, increasing the pressure as she struggled. "Let me go, please," she whimpered. The pressure eased suddenly, then the hands released her waist. She felt them move up to her shoulders. Slowly her body was being turned around to face the unseen presence. In her terror, Kathy became aware of the overwhelming stench of the same cheap perfume. Then another pair of hands gripped her wrists. Kathy says she sensed a struggle going on over possession of her body, that somehow she had been trapped between two powerful forces. Escape was impossible, and she felt she was going to die. The pressure on her body became overwhelming, and Kathy passed out. When she came to, she was lying half off the bed with her head almost touching the floor. Danny had come into the room in answer to her call. Kathy knew the presences were gone. She couldn't have been out more than a moment. "Call Daddy at his office, Danny. Hurry!" Danny returned in a few minutes. "The man on the telephone says Daddy just left Syosset. He thinks he's coming back here." George did not come back to the house until early afternoon. When he reached Amityville, he drove up Merrick Road towards the street and stopped off at the Witch's Brew for a beer. The neighborhood bar was warm and empty. The jukebox and television set were silent, and the only sounds in the place were those of the bartender washing glasses. When George entered, the man looked up and recognized him from the other day. "Hey, man, good to see you again." George nodded in return and stood up at the bar. "A Miller's," he ordered. George watched while the bartender filled a glass. He was a roly-poly young guy, somewhere in his late 20s, with a stomach that suggested he liked to sample the beer he sold. George took a long sip, half emptying the tall stein, before putting it down on the dark wood bar. "Tell me something," George belched. "Did you know the DeFeos?" The young man had resumed his glass washing. He nodded. "Yeah, I knew them. Why?" "I'm living in their house now, and—" "I know," the bartender interrupted. George lifted his eyebrows in surprise. "The first time you came in here, you said you'd just moved into 112 Ocean. That's the DeFeos." George finished off his beer. "They ever come in here?" The bartender put down a clean glass and wiped his hands on a towel. "Only Ronnie did. Sometimes he brought in his sister Dawn. Cute kid." He picked up George's empty glass. "You know, you look a lot like Ronnie, the beard and all. I think you're older than he is, though." "Did he ever talk about the house?" The bartender put a new beer in front of George. "The house?" "Yeah, you know, like, did he ever say there was anything funny going on there? Stuff like that?" George took a sip. "You think there's something bad about the joint? I mean, now after the murders?" No, George raised a hand. "I was just asking whether he ever said anything about that night." The bartender looked around the bar as if to confirm there was no one else around. "Ronnie never said anything like that to me personally." He leaned close to George. "But I'll tell you something. I was there once. They threw a big party, and Ronnie's old man hired me to take care of the bar." George had finished half of his second beer. "What did you think of the place?" The bartender spread his fat arms wide. "Big. Real big joint. I didn't see too much of it, though. I was down in the basement. A lot of booze and beer flowed that night. It was their anniversary." He looked around the bar again. "Did you know they got a secret room down there?" George pretended ignorance. "No. Where?" "Uh-huh," the bartender said. "You take a look behind those closets, and you'll find something'll really shake you." George leaned over the bar. "What is it?" "A room. A little room. I found it that night I was down in the basement. There's this plywood closet built up beside the stairs. I'm using it to ice beer in, see? When I bumped a keg against one end of the closet, it seems the whole wall is loose. You know, like a secret panel, something out of an old movie." "Well, what about the room?" George prodded. The bartender nodded. "Yeah, well, when I bumped the plywood, it came open, and I could see this dark space behind it. The light bulb wasn't working, so I lit a match, and sure enough, there's this weird little room, all painted red." "You're putting me on," George protested. The bartender put his right hand over his heart. "God's honest truth, man, so help me. You'll see." George finished his second beer. "I'll certainly have to look for that." He put $1 on the bar. "That's for the beers." He put down another. "And that's for yourself." "Hey, thanks, man." The bartender looked up at George. "You want to know something really flaky about that little room? I used to have nightmares about it." "Nightmares? Like what?" "Oh, sometimes I'd dream that people, I don't know who they were killing dogs and pigs in there and using their blood for some kind of ceremony." "Dogs and pigs?" "Yeah." The bartender waved his hand in disgust. "I guess the place, the red paint and all, really got to me." When George got home, he and Kathy both had stories to tell each other. She described the frightening event in their bedroom, and he related what the bartender at the Witch's Brew had told him about the red room in the basement. The Lutzes finally realized that there was something going on that was beyond their control. "Please call Father Mancuso," Kathy begged. "Ask him to come back." Father Mancuso's superior had been concerned with his health and had dropped by to look in on him. Father Mancuso told the bishop that he felt much better that morning. They had decided to spend some time together to review the priest's workload. Most of the backlog was quickly cleared up and put in the bishop's briefcase. His secretary would do the typing. Father Mancuso saw his superior to the building entrance and then walked back into his apartment. The phone was ringing. He was still wearing the soft white cotton surgical gloves he had found in a drawer. The priest had explained to the bishop that he had put them on his hands to protect them from cold, but his real motive was to hide the ugly rawness of his blisters. The priest's telephone rang 5 times before he picked it up. "Hello, this is Father Mancuso." The voice on the other end came through loud and clear. "Father, this is George." The priest couldn't believe his ears. It was as if George was standing right in the room with him. He was so surprised that he blurted, "George? George Lutz, Kathy's husband." "Oh, hi, how are you?" George held the receiver away from his ear and looked at Kathy standing next to him in the kitchen. "What's with him?" he whispered to her. "He sounds like he doesn't remember me." Father Mancuso knew who George was, all right, but he was still stunned to hear from him on an open line without any interference at all. "I'm sorry, George. I didn't mean to be rude. I just wasn't ready for your call this way after all the trouble I've had reaching you." "Yeah," answered George. "I know what you mean." Father Mancuso waited for George to continue, but there was only silence. "George, you still there?" "Yes, Father," said George. "I'm here, and Kathy's right beside me." He looked at his wife. "We want you to come back and bless the house." Father Mancuso thought of what had befallen him the first time he had blessed the Lutz's home. He looked at his white-gloved hands. "Father, can you come right away?" The priest hesitated. He didn't want to go back there, but he couldn't tell George that in so many words. "Well, George," he finally answered, "I don't know if I can right now. I have the flu again, you see, and the doctor doesn't want me running around in this cold weather." "Well," George interrupted, "when can you come?" Father Mancuso began to look for a way out. "Why do you want me to bless the house again? You don't do that just at the drop of a hat, you know." George was desperate. "Look, we owe you a dinner. You come and Kathy will cook you the best steak you've ever had. Then you can stay overnight." "Oh, I couldn't do that, George." "Well, we'll make you drunk enough to stay." Father Mancuso couldn't believe what he just heard. You just don't say such things to a priest. "Listen here, young man, Father, we're in a lot of trouble. We need your help." The priest's anger evaporated. "What's the matter?" he said. "There are things happening around this house we don't understand. We've seen a lot of—" The telephone line began to crackle on both ends. "What'd you say, George? I didn't hear you." There would be no more conversation between the two men. There was no longer anything to be heard on the line but static and a loud whirring sound. Both men knew it was no use and hung up their telephones. George turned to Kathy and looked around the room. It started again. It's killed the phone. By the time Father Mancuso put down the receiver, his hands were burning again. God forgive me, he said aloud, but George is going to have to find someone else to help. There's no way I'm going back to that house. Chapter 15, January 2nd to 3rd. Disappointed that they couldn't convince Father Mancuso to return to their house, George and Kathy discussed other ways of getting help. Both had agreed that now that they had already moved in, it would be unseemly to ask the local parish priest in Amityville to bless the house. Besides, he had been the confessor to the DeFeos, and George recalled from the newspaper accounts that he was an elderly man who pooh-poohed the thought of voices in the house telling Ronnie what to do. He wasn't much of a believer in occult phenomenon. At one point, George talked of vandalism. Possibly someone was trying to frighten them out of the house, using violent acts of destruction to hurry their departure. Kathy had her own opinions. When she had said something had touched her, had George thought it was just her imagination? He didn't. Could he explain the horrible figure burned into the brick wall of the fireplace? He couldn't. Had they really seen a pig's tracks in the snow? They had. Would he agree that there was a powerful force in the house that could hurt the family? He did. What were they going to do? When they went to bed at night, George told her he had decided to go to the Amityville Police Department the next day. During the night of January 2nd, George again had the urge to check out the boathouse and found Harry fast asleep in his doghouse. The next morning, he drove Harry to the animal hospital in Deer Park that he had been using and had them check the dog over thoroughly. It had cost him $35 to discover that Harry was sound and didn't appear to be drugged or poisoned. The vet suggested that the animal's lassitude might possibly have developed from a change in his diet. On the morning of January 2nd, Father Mancuso again blessed the Lutzes' home. He didn't perform the ceremony in Amityville, but at the Sacred Heart Church in North Merrick. In the church, the priest held a votive mass, a mass that does not correspond with one prescribed for the day, but is said for a special intention at the choice of the celebrant. Father Mancuso had removed his gloves. He knelt at the altar and opened his missal. He began, "I am the Savior of all people, says the Lord. Whatever the troubles, I will answer their cry, and I will always be their Lord." The priest crossed himself and read aloud the opening chapter of the Mass. God, our Father, our strength in adversity, our health in weakness, our comfort in sorrow, be merciful to your people. Father Mancuso lifted his eyes to the figure on the cross. As you have given us the punishment we deserve, give us also new life and hope as we rest in your kindness. We ask this forever and ever. Amen. He closed his missal, but kept his eyes on Jesus. Lord, look kindly on the Lutzes in their sufferings, and by the death of your Son, endured for us, turn away from them your anger and the punishment their sins deserve. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. After the votive Mass, Father Mancuso returned to his apartment to find a stupefying odor of human excrement pervading his rooms. He gagged but managed to throw open all the windows. The freezing air rushed in, providing momentary relief. But then the stench overpowered even the cold wind. Father Mancuso ran to his bathroom to see if somehow the toilet had backed up. But no, there was nothing amiss, not until you tried to breathe. The priest knew there was a cesspool under the front lawn of the rectory and dry wells behind the parking lot. He enlisted the aid of the maintenance man, and together they found that no animals had been trapped in the wells and that the cesspool was in good working order. There had been no apparent leaks in the plumbing. Finally, the horrible odor began to pervade the entire rectory. Other priests, driven from their rooms, gathered in the lobby of the school building across the yard. The pastor was extremely upset over the incident and suggested that everyone burn incense to drive out the noxious stench. Up to that point, Father Mancuso had not attributed the source of the smell to his own apartment, but after lighting the incense in his rooms and returning to the school building with the others, the priest realized that his apartment had been the first struck, evidently while he had been celebrating the special Mass for the Lutzes. He then made the terrifying connection. A disembodied voice in 112 Ocean Avenue had told him to get out. Whoever that voice belonged to, it had reached clear across to the rectory to give him the same message. There was another connection Father Mancuso had been trying to make. He realized it when he stood by the windows in the lobby and looked across to his apartment in the rectory, remembering one of the lessons he learned in demonology. The odor of human excrement was always associated with the appearance of the devil. In the afternoon, Detective Sergeant Pat Camarotto of the Amityville Police Department went along with George, saw the wrecked garage door and the animal tracks still visible in the frozen snow, and then went into the house. He was introduced to Kathy and the children. She repeated her story of the ghost-like touchings and took the sergeant into the living room to show him the image burned into the fireplace wall. Even after George and Kathy showed him the red room in the basement, they sensed Camarotto's skepticism. He had listened to George's version of the evil use of the hideaway, nodded when George mentioned Ronnie DeFeo as the builder of the secret room, then asked the Lutzes whether they had any concrete facts to base their fears on. "I can't work on what you believe you've seen or heard. Maybe you ought to get a priest in here," he suggested. "It sounds more like his kind of job than a cop's." Sergeant Pat Camarotto left the Lutz's house and got into his car. He knew he hadn't helped the young couple at all, but there was really nothing he could do for them, except maybe have a cruiser stop by once in a while. There had been no use in frightening them anymore, he had told himself as he drove off. Why make things worse by mentioning that he had felt strong vibrations, a creepy feeling the moment he had once again walked into 112 Ocean Avenue? When the sun went down, there still wasn't very much relief from the stench at the Sacred Heart Rectory. The heavy smoke released by the burning incense had got into everyone's eyes and lungs. The priests who remained in the building were no longer able to tell whether they were nauseous from the smoke or from the original smell. Father Mancuso had left his windows wide open in the hope that the cold air would eventually drive the odor from his rooms, but that effort backfired. The inrushing wind had only blocked the smoke and smell from getting out. The priest had wanted to tell the others that he knew what had happened and why, but he kept his own counsel, praying for a quick deliverance from this latest humiliation. Immediately after Sergeant Camarotto had left, George noticed the compressor in the boathouse had stopped. There was no reason for the machine stopping unless it had overloaded the circuits and blown a fuse. That meant he would have to go down to the basement in the main house and examined the fuse box. George knew the box was in the area of the storage closets and took a fresh box of fuses down with him. In the cellar, he quickly discovered the blown fuse and replaced it. He heard the compressor start up again, making a loud racket as it began to churn, but waited to see if another overload would occur. After a few moments, he was satisfied and started to go back upstairs. When he was halfway up the cellar steps, George became aware of the smell. It wasn't fuel oil. He had his flashlight with him, but the lights in the basement were still on. From his position on the stairs, George had been able to see almost the entire cellar. He sniffed and then sensed the foul odor was coming from the area near the northeast corner by the plywood storage closets that shielded the secret red room. George went back down the stairs and warily approached the storage closets. As he stood before the shelving that hid the small room, the odor became stronger. Holding his nose, George forced open the paneling and shone his flashlight around the red-painted walls. The stench of human excrement was heavy in the confined space. It formed a choking fog. Nauseated, George's stomach began to heave. He had just enough time to pull the panel back into place and shut out the mist before he vomited, fouling his clothes and the floor. Father Mancuso and the pastor of the Sacred Heart Rectory had been friends for several years, ever since the priest had been assigned to the parish. With Father Mancuso's rise in reputation and prominence within the diocese, their friendship had ripened, and the two priests had become close companions. There was a 20-year difference in their ages, Father Mancuso being 42, but there was no generation gap. On the night of January 3rd, all that changed. Depressed with the unrelenting, disgusting odor that permeated his rectory, the pastor turned on Father Mancuso, and their comradeship was irrevocably destroyed. It started in the pastor's office, where Father Mancuso had gone to pick up the reports that had been typed for him. He was about to return to his own rooms when the pastor walked in with 3 other priests. They had just finished dinner, such as it was, with the clergymen unable to rid themselves of the odor that permeated their clothes. The pastor glared across the room at Father Mancuso, who was standing beside a desk. "I don't know why the bishop assigns you all those cases," he barked. "I'm a better judge than you. I've got more experience." Father Mancuso was stunned. He couldn't believe what he had just heard. "Why, that man's jealous of me," he thought. "Yes, that's true enough," Father Mancuso said gently in reply, "but you've never objected to my work before." The pastor waved his hand at Father Mancuso in dismissal. The other priests had looks of amazement on their faces. He had never spoken like this, particularly about his close friend. The pastor's next words puzzled them even more. "Look at him, the great psychotherapist." The pastor's face had become red with rage. "Judge, doctor, how come you're so smart, huh?" What had got into this man? Father Mancuso looked at the other priests. They were avoiding his eyes, embarrassed at being included in the outbreak. Then Father Mancuso spoke up. "I think this business with the odor is getting the best of you, my friend. It would be better if we talked at another time and in another place." He rose to leave the room. "Oh, no, Your Honor," cried the pastor, moving quickly as if to block Father Mancuso's exit. "Let's get it all out now. We'll leave it up to the boys here to see just how big a fake you are." "That's enough, Pastor," the youngest of the 3 other priests had stepped between the two antagonists. "Father Mancuso is right. We're all upset with this disgusting smell. We'd be better off trying to devote ourselves and energies to getting rid of it than adding to its stink." The sudden attack from an unexpected source deflated the pastor. He retreated, but continued to glare with hatred at Father Mancuso. There was a look to his eyes, Father Mancuso is now convinced, that came from someone or something within the pastor's body. Something had momentarily taken possession of the priest and was continuing to spew its venom at Father Mancuso, just as it had in befouling the rectory with its excremental odor. George had finally managed to clean himself up after the disastrous trip to the basement. He and Kathy were sitting in the kitchen over coffee. It was after 11 p.m., and both were tired from the tension of the ever-increasing incidents. Only the kitchen seemed relatively safe, and they were reluctant to go up to bed. "Listen," George said, "it's getting chilly in here. Let's at least go into the living room where it's warmer." He got up from his chair, but Kathy remained seated. "What are we going to do?" she asked. "Things are getting worse. I'm really scared something can happen to the kids." Kathy looked up at her husband. "God knows what's going to happen next around here." "Look," he answered, "just keep the kids out of the cellar until I set up a fan down there. Then I'm going to brick up the door to that room so it never bothers us again." He took Kathy's arm and pulled her up from the chair. "I also want to talk to Eric at my office. He says his girlfriend's got a lot of experience investigating haunted houses." "Haunted houses?" Kathy interrupted. "Do you think this house is haunted? By what?" She followed him towards the living room, then stopped in the hallway. "I just had a thought, George. Do you think our TM had anything to do with all this?" George shook his head. "No, nothing at all. It couldn't have been the transcendental meditation. But what I do know is that we've got to get help somewhere. It might as well be." As they entered the living room, Kathy's scream cut off the rest of George's words. He looked to where she was pointing. The ceramic lion that George had carried up to the sewing room was on the table next to Kathy's chair, its jaws bared at George and Kathy. Chapter 16. January 4th to 5th. George grabbed the lion off the living room table and threw it into a garbage can outside the house. It took him quite a while to calm Kathy down because he couldn't possibly explain how the porcelain piece had managed to come back down from the sewing room. She insisted that something in the house had done it and didn't want to spend another minute in 112 Ocean Avenue. George had confided to Kathy that he too felt uneasy about the lion's sudden reappearance, but he couldn't agree on running away without taking a chance at fighting back. "How can you fight what you can't see?" Kathy asked. This thing can do anything it wants." "No, honey," George said. "There's no way you can convince me a lot of this isn't just our imagination. I just don't believe in spooks. No way, no how, no time." Finally, he talked Kathy into going up to bed with a promise that if he couldn't get help by the next day, they would get out of the house for a while. They both were completely drained. Kathy fell asleep out of sheer exhaustion. George dozed off, waking every once in a while to listen groggily for any unnatural noises in the house. He says that he had no idea how long he had lain there before he heard the marching music downstairs. His head was keeping time to the drum beats before he realized he was listening to music. Glancing at Kathy to see if she had been awakened, he heard her breathe deeply. She was fast asleep. George ran out of the room into the hall and heard the stomp of marching feet get louder. There must be at least 50 musicians parading around on the first floor, he thought. But the moment he hit the bottom step and turned on the hall light, the sounds ceased. George froze on the staircase, his eyes and head swiveling frantically to catch any sign of movement. There was absolutely no one there. It was as though he had walked into an echo chamber. After the cacophony of sound, the sudden silence sent chills up his back. Then George heard heavy breathing and thought someone was right behind him. He spun around. No one was there, and he then realized he was listening to Kathy from all the way upstairs. Fear of her being alone in the bedroom galvanized George. He raced back up the steps 2 at a time and into his room, turning on the light. There, floating 2 feet above the bed, was Kathy. She was slowly drifting away from him towards the windows. "Kathy!" George yelled, jumping up on the bed to grab his wife. She was as stiff as a board in his hands, but her drifting stopped. George felt a resistance to his pull, then a sudden release of pressure, and he and Kathy fell heavily off the bed onto the floor. The fall awakened her. When she saw where she was, Kathy was incoherent for a moment. "Where am I?" she cried. "What's happened?" George started to help her up. She could hardly stand. "It's nothing," he reassured her. "You were having a dream and fell out of bed. That's all." Kathy was still too dazed to question George any further. She said, "Oh," meekly got back into bed and immediately fell back into a deep sleep. George turned out the light in the room, but did not return to his wife's side. He sat on a chair beside the windows, watching Kathy and looking out at the lightening sky of early morning. Father Mancuso was also watching the new day break from his mother's house in Queens, where he had gone shortly after the altercation with his pastor. Not that he was afraid of a continued outburst, but it had been impossible to sleep in his stench-filled, incense-smoked apartment. Also, he now truly believed that he was the target of the demonic phenomenon, and thought that the odor would go if he left the rectory for a while. At first, Father Mancuso had misgivings about being in his mother's home because he didn't want to involve her in this problem. But then he had begun to feel feverish and decided that if he was to be sick again, he'd rather be under her care. He hadn't had much sleep and awakened a few minutes before dawn. He felt his palms itching and took off his white gloves to examine his hands. He considered himself lucky that the pastor hadn't spotted them. Certainly the man would have seized on that in denouncing his former friend. The skies were laced with long streaks of white clouds. He noted that they were low and moving fast. With the cold spell still holding in the low teens, that could mean more snow. Father Mancuso turned away from the window and looked at the clock on the nightstand. It was only 7 a.m. "I'd like to call George Lutz," he thought, "to find out if the Mass caused any similar reaction at his house. But no, 7 might be too early." Father Mancuso decided to wait a while and got back into bed. It was nice and warm under the covers. Sleepily, he heard his mother stirring in the kitchen, and suddenly he was 10 years old, waiting for her to call him to get up for school. The recent pains, aches, and humiliations fled from his mind and body. Father Mancuso was sleeping safely in his old bed in his mother's house. By 10 in the morning, Kathy was still in a deep sleep. George had become worried about her condition after the past night's terrifying experience. He couldn't wait any longer. He had to call Father Mancuso again. Danny and Chris had told their father that they had heard on their radio that the Amityville schools were closed because of a heating problem. They were somewhat disappointed because it would have been their first day at their new school after the Christmas holidays and a chance to meet some new friends. George thought he was lucky not to have to drive the boys to school. It was clear across town, and he hadn't really wanted to leave Kathy and Missy alone in the house. He fed the children their breakfast and set them up to play in their bedroom. Then he looked in on Kathy. Her face was pale, drawn, with deep lines around her mouth. He didn't want to waken her and went back down to the kitchen. When he saw that it was 11 a.m., George decided to call the priest. When he dialed Father Mancuso's private number, there was no answer. George called the rectory itself and was informed that Father Mancuso was visiting his mother. No, they couldn't give out her number, but would give Father Mancuso the message that George had called. George sat in the kitchen the rest of the morning, waiting for the return call. He thought he had been a fool to mouth off about not believing in spooks. Kathy was right. How the hell can you fight something that can lift you clear off the bed like a stick of wood? George Lutz, ex-Marine, admitted he was scared. Kathy came downstairs just as the telephone rang. It was George's office calling to ask when he was coming in. The Internal Revenue agent was due back, and they did not know how George wanted to handle the situation. George squirmed. Finally, he told his bookkeeper to call their accountant and postpone the appointment until the following week. As for his coming in, he said Kathy didn't feel well and they were waiting for the doctor. Kathy sat next to George at the kitchen table and looked strangely at her husband. She mouthed the word, "Doctor?" to him. George shook his head at her and ended the call by telling his office he'd get back to them later. "Boy," he said to Kathy, "are they ever getting fed up with me? I'll just have to go in tomorrow." Kathy yawned at George and shrugged her shoulders in an effort to ease the stiffness in her body. "My God," she said, "look at the time. Why'd you let me sleep so long? Have the kids eaten? Are the boys in school?" George started counting on his fingers. "First," he answered, "you haven't slept so good in weeks, so I left you alone." He held up 2 fingers. "Yes, they ate breakfast." 3 fingers. "There was no school today. I sent them upstairs to play with Missy." Good, he thought to himself. Kathy hadn't remembered anything about what happened last night, and I'm not going to tell her. "I've been trying to get a hold of Father Mancuso again," George continued. "They say he's at his mother's, but he'll call me as soon as they hear from him." Father Mancuso's mother didn't disturb his needed rest until almost 3 in the afternoon. He knew his fever had dropped because he no longer had a light-headed feeling. The priest was doubly pleased when he finally checked in with the rectory. The priest who answered the phone said that the incense had driven out the horrible smell and all were back in their rooms and offices. "Father, also George Lutz called you." "Oh, yes," he reminded himself. "I meant to call him, but it completely slipped my mind." Father Mancuso said he'd return by evening. He then called George. The phone was picked up on the first ring. "George, this is Father Mancuso." "Father, am I glad you called. We must talk to you right away. Can you please come over here now?" "But I've already blessed your house again," Father Mancuso answered. "I said a votive mass for you at the church the other day. And by the way, "It's not to bless the house," George interrupted. "It's more than that now." For the next several minutes, George recounted what had happened at 112 Ocean Avenue since he had moved in. He sent Kathy upstairs under the pretext of getting him her cigarettes, and then told the priest about her levitating. "That's why we need you, Father," George concluded. "I'm scared of what's going to happen to Kathy and the kids." All through George's recitation, Father Mancuso had remained silent. He had thought he was the only one who had suffered a demonic attack. Now he was ashamed to realize that he had been avoiding the inevitable. "Come on, man, you're a priest," he thought to himself. "If I don't want to wear the collar and accept its responsibilities, why, by God, the pastor was right. I am a fake." Father Mancuso took a deep breath. "All right, George, I'll try and get there to..." George didn't hear what Father Mancuso said next. Suddenly there were several loud moans on the line, and then a crackling that almost shattered his eardrum. "Father, I can't hear you." A continued moaning was the only answer George got. On the other end, Father Mancuso felt as if he had been physically slapped in the face. He put down the telephone, put his hand to his cheek, and began to cry. "I'm afraid to go back there." He looked at his sore palms and then buried his face within them. "Oh God, help me, help me." George knew it was useless to wait for Father Mancuso to call back. Even if he did, they would have been prevented from talking to one another about the house. But George had one hope. He was sure he had heard the priest say he'd come, but he didn't know when. He'd just have to sit there and wait. Father Mancuso returned to the rectory after 8 in the evening. Now it was almost 10 o'clock, and the priest sat and stared at the telephone. The smell of excrement had gone from his quarters, as he'd been told, but the acrid sting of incense still hung in the air. That he could tolerate. What he couldn't stand was his inability to go to the Lutzes. Even the thought of the children being in danger from the demonic behavior couldn't overcome his fear of what might await him at 112 Ocean Avenue. Finally, Father Mancuso picked up the telephone and called the Chancellor's office in the Rockville Center Diocese. He asked to see the Chancellors and was told to come in the next morning. He then prepared to go to bed. He had had enough sleep that morning at his mother's, but he was exhausted again. Before putting on his pajamas, he went into the bathroom to remove the white gloves. The Burroughs solution had helped soothe the affliction, and he wanted to soak his palms once more that night. When he peeled off the gloves, he was stunned. He turned his hands over and examined the palms. There were no more ugly splotches or open sores. There was no sign of bleeding. The blisters were gone. Kathy had never really come to herself all that day and night. She sat by the fireplace in the living room. George fed the children and eventually sent them off to bed. The boys didn't complain that it was too early because they knew they'd have to get up for school. Evidently, the heating problem had been solved because the local Amityville radio station had announced that the schools would be open the next morning. George had even helped Missy take her bath. He read his daughter a story before she let him turn off her light. The last words Missy said before he closed her door were, "Good night, Daddy. Good night, Jody." When he saw it was almost 11, George realized that Father Mancuso wasn't coming that night. Kathy had been drooping in her chair for the past hour, her eyes closing with the warmth of the fire. Finally, she announced to George she was going up to bed. George looked at his wife. Not once had she mentioned getting away from the house. It was as though none of the frightening incidents had ever occurred, and it was just natural for her to want to go to sleep. They went up to their bedroom together. Kathy mumbled that she was too sleepy to take a bath and would do it in the morning. She was asleep as soon as her head hit the pillow. George sat on the edge of the bed for a while, watching Kathy breathe deeply. Then he went out to check on Harry. The dog was asleep again. his food untouched. George was about to reach down and shake the animal when he heard the marching band strike up in his house. He ran back in through the kitchen. The drums and horns were blasting away in the living room. George heard the stomping of many feet as he tore through the hallway. The lights were still on, but he could see there was no one in the room. The very instant he could see into the living room, the music had cut off. George looked about wildly. "You son of a bitches, where are you?" he screamed. George took in great gulps of air. Then he realized there was something strange about the living room. Every piece of furniture had been moved. The rug had been rolled back. Chairs, couch, and tables had been pushed against the walls as if to make room for a lot of dancers or a marching band. Thank you for listening to this week's episode, and I hope you'll join us next week for more of the Amityville Horror. And until then, have a great week, everyone.